Okay, now that I have my skeleton in place in my model, and everything has been adjusted for this, I'm going to go ahead and skin it. So the first thing I'm going to do, it's pretty simple, is just select my Rhino Geo here, which is the model itself, and I'm going to command and select that root joint, and then I'm going to go up to skin and say bind skin. I'm going to go to the options of bind skin, and I'm going to change. This is how the tool looks when you first open it. So there's a couple things I want to change about this. The first thing is the bind method. I think we want to bind to the joint hierarchy, the complete joint hierarchy. The bind method here, I want to choose closest in hierarchy. Closest in distance isn't great because it means that the vertices down here, and this is saying like which vertices are going to be assigned which influence over which joints are going to influence which vertices in the model. So if I have closest in distance, well then some of this foot might influence this foot because they're closer in distance, but I don't want that. I want it to be closest in the hierarchy of the joint chain. So let's go to closest in hierarchy. And then the skinning method, I've heard that dual quaternion is good. I'm not sure exactly the minutia of the difference between the skinning methods. And then max influence is, how many joints can have influence over how many vertices. So I think we'll leave that at that. And the rest of this is fine. Just make sure that you change this to closest in hierarchy is the most important thing. And then we'll say apply and close. Now you'll see our kind of dark purple joint hierarchy that we had in the scene before is replaced by this nice rainbow one, which shows you where the root joint is, and then down the different, the kind of different pathways of which are child objects of each joint. So we kind of have a visual representation of the hierarchy of that skeleton, and then it also says that it's bound to the skin. So we can go ahead and test this. And remember, we always rotate joints. We don't move them. So here we have our translate values for these joints have varying, uh, they have, values here, but what we're really going to be doing is using the rotate tool in order to manipulate this skeleton. The root joint itself is the only one that you might want to think about moving. And now you'll see that that entire, not the eyes, they're separate, but that entire mesh is now being controlled by all of the joints that are in that joint hierarchy, which is why it's moving when I'm selecting that root joint. But besides the root joint, everything else is going to rotate. And then remember here, I have my display layer so I can turn on and off the restrict the ability to click on the geometry here. I can also do that up here where I say I'm going to turn off my ability to select the mesh itself. And so now, even though this is not turned to restricted, I'm just able to select the joints. So I'm going to go ahead and maybe select this joint and I'm going to say rotate, and we can see how this joint is going to affect the mesh. And then as we're rotating, it's giving a different value in these different channels. And this is how we will animate, but we want to first fix some of the issues that might come up about from the way that the skin has been bound. For example, here, there's kind of a harsh line that I might want to adjust. And so if I ever want to get back to my bind pose, then that's what we had originally. So here you can see, I think that this shoulder joint, when I go to manipulate in the rotation of this joint, we can see that it's influencing these vertices maybe too much or not without enough of a kind of fall off or gradient. And so I can kind of just test out how these different joints are affecting different parts of the body. For example, here, I really only want this joint to be affecting the tail, but it's also pulling the belly in here in the rear end area of this rhino. And then here, maybe the knee, right? The knee seems to be affecting parts of the mesh as well. So I can go to my root joint for a moment and say modify. No, sorry, not modify, select hierarchy. And so it's going to select everything in the hierarchy, and I can go into these values. Even though there's 0 here, I can hit a value of 0 again, and that will change those rotation values for every joint in the joint hierarchy. And this is how we can get back to this kind of bind pose. So now in order to get the skinning to affect the mesh, the joints to affect the mesh in a better way, we want to use this paint skin weights tool. So I'm going to go to my options here for the skin weights, and I'm going to want to select my mesh itself. And now you see that I have a kind of different view of the model. I'm going to go into my tool settings for the paint weights tool, and I have my whole joint hierarchy here. And what you're looking at is a kind of gray scale of each joint in the hierarchy and its effect over the mesh. So for example, if I go to my left back knee, you can see here that it's affecting this part of the body that I don't want it to. And so now what I do is I go in and I paint values on the vertices for each joint. And this takes a while, but it gets easier the more you do it. So for example, I'm going to maybe, I'll start with this hip. And with the hip, I might say, I don't really want it affecting this area. So I'm going to go, I'm going to change, I'm going to be in paint mode here. I'm just scrolling through. So for this left hip, I'm going to scroll down and I'm going to change this to a value of 0 and an opacity of 1. And I'm going to go and paint on these vertices a value of 0. I don't want that hip to be affecting these vertices here. And I'm only going to paint weights on one side because we're able to mirror the weights after. And this is why good topology is so important, because we want to be able to work in these kind of bands or these loops around the model. And we want to make sure we have one in the center of the model as well, so that we can mirror it and so that it just makes it so much easier to know exactly where I'm painting. There's also an ability to smooth. So if I turn on smooth, it's going to change. It's going to kind of paint, smooth that influence. So I'm going to go back to replace here. And I might want to say I don't want any influence over these for that hip. Maybe even here, this is too high along the hip. And then I might want to go maybe even here because I have that back joint too. And then I might go to smooth and I might say, well, let's smooth the transition between the vertices surrounding the ones that are given full influence and the ones that have no influence. All right, so now if I go down to the knee, let's scroll back up, let's go to that knee, and let's do the same thing where we're going to replace with the value of 0. I definitely don't want the knee to have any influence over the belly. So let's just paint a value of 0 over all of these vertices. And as well here, I don't want it to, so for this like edge loop of vertices, I'm going to paint a value of 0. I would like that knee just to really be influencing the knee portion of this leg. Okay, so I have that kind of painted. Maybe I'll go to smooth now, kind of smooth that out so it can have a bit of a better transition between the top part of the leg and the bottom. And let's go down to the, let's go back to the hip. Make sure that we go back to the knee and then go down to the foot, get rid of all of this in the foot. The foot looks okay. Maybe the back of the leg doesn't need to be influencing, have influence from that foot joint. And then the toe is fine to be in the front, but again, get rid of it here. I can hit the B key and that will allow me to, if I press and hold the B key, I can change the size of that brush. So that's helpful too. Okay, and then we won't do the right side. We're just going to work with the left side here. Let's go to the back now. And the back looks like it's kind of influencing one side more than the other. So that back joint, I really want that root joint to be in charge in these middle spine 1, 2, and 3, to be controlling the front of the body. So I'm going to, again, working in these edge loops, which really helps to define the flow of vertices around the model. I'm going to paint a value of 0 here to remove any influence over this part of the mesh from that back. And then maybe I'll go here and turn the value up to 100 and paint those into the back of the model. So I'd like that back to have influence over the back of the model. I'm going to paint a value of 100 or a value of 1 over these vertices here. And then maybe I will go to smooth and try to kind of smooth out the influence here, so it will transition a little bit better. Maybe down around the bottom of this model, I'm going to replace with a value of 0, or yeah, replace with a value of 0 these. And then also the tail, I'm going to let the tail joint kind of do the work for the tail. And so then it's really important to maybe paint around this part and here as well, but not on the tail if I can avoid it at this time. But now maybe I'll put in an opacity of 0.5 or a value actually of 0.5. And let's see if I can get some of the influence off from that back joint of these vertices here on the legs. And hopefully that those hip joints will do most of the work for how the legs are going to move. And remember, when this back joint moves, right, the hip will go with it because it's up the chain. So the back and everything that's below it. So I'm still going to have to go in and kind of adjust the values here because it kind of does change what's being affected by which joint. And there's only really, this is kind of our first pass. So then we go back to the back. And then let's go to the tail joint from the back, go down to the tail. And this needs a lot of work. So for some reason, the tail is influencing this part of the belly. And so I want to remove all influence everywhere except really just the tail itself. So I'm going to press B, make that brush smaller, paint a value of 0 all the way around this tail because that tail joint should just be for affecting the tail itself and not any of the mesh around it. And we're doing this with a black and white view, but if we turn on this color ramp, we can also see that there maybe is just a bit of influence being exerted elsewhere because of the way that the rest of the joint hierarchy is functioning. So there's the tail end. Let's also make sure that the tail end is not influencing anything on the mesh itself. And I'm going to turn back off this color ramp. Make sure that that tail end isn't influencing everything. So I'm going to go back to my outliner here, and now I'm going to see how this mesh moves on this left side. If I go to rotate, it's still, that hip is still affecting the belly quite a bit. So at this point, I'm going to start to manipulate the model quite a bit, and kind of give its deform this knee or rotate this knee in a way that's really exaggerated so that when I go to paint the skin weights on it, I'm really able to see what I'm doing. So let's go up to this knee, left hip, and see what's affecting that part. And it's this knee is still affecting it. So let's give it a value of 0 and paint an influence of 0 all over. Let's go down to the foot. The foot is really influencing everything here. Paint a value of 0 and the toe. So if we start to paint values of 0 all over this part of the mesh, and we must have something else is affecting it, it's that hip. So the hip. And so I'm going to really have to zoom in and try to identify. Let's go to the back here too. And it seems like the back is having an issue. So let's smooth this out. Let's try to smooth this all out so we can really see what's going on. And then let's replace with a value of 0 all of these vertices. Or actually, it looks like we actually need more. Let's see. The root joint doesn't look like it's affecting as much as it should. So with a value of, we need a value of 1 for all these joints that the root joint needs to be affecting. So you really need to make these kind of exaggerated poses on your mesh. On your skeleton in order to really know what's affecting what. So even here, like this hip needs to be affecting a lot more of this mesh. So let's go to the hip here and let's give it a value of 1, but maybe an opacity of 0.5 so we can kind of really paint in some of this influence. So I'm going to go in and start to paint more influence over this part of the mesh. And here it really looks pretty exaggerated. So I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to go to smooth, and I'm going to make my brush bigger, and I'm going to try to smooth these values out. And I'm going to go to the back here and say that I want the back. Let's go use that smooth tool again. And so let's go to the knee. The knee isn't a problem. It might be, let's just keep trying to smooth this out so that we have a smoother transition from one side of the model to the other. And especially here with the way that this is stretching. Let me increase my opacity. The knee is still influencing this, which is the problem. So we'll go to replace, value of 0, and pop those down. Now that should be a little bit calmer. The foot as well. I don't want the foot affecting any of this, and the toe. So back up to the hip. The knee looks good, the foot looks good, and the toe. But back here, and I'm going to go back to smooth and just try to smooth this out. All right, that's looking okay. That's looking way better. That's for that back hip. Now I might want to, for that back hip, let's replace with let's say an opacity of 0.5, which is nice because then we can paint in a value of 1. We can start to kind of paint more influence over some of these vertices also, which doesn't look great because it's kind of pulling it in rather than pushing it out. So I might just kind of leave it there and instead have that hip really be affecting just that leg. So I think actually you can kind of through trial and error see what is going to be the best way to work with your skeleton. And again, I'm just going to try to smooth this out as much as I can to transition so that so this leg looks good. All right, so now I'm going to go back here to this, and let's maybe rotate this front spine, and let's pull that up. And so now you see that this is really deforming in a strange way. I'm going to go to my tool settings here and back to paint skin weights, make sure I'm actually on the Rhino itself. And we are working now with spine 1. And that's spine 1, and it really has very little influence. So go back to replace, and let's paint in a lot of, let's start by just painting some influence for that spine over these vertices. And now, because I've really exaggerated this, really using that smooth, it's going to really help me see actually how this is deforming the mesh. But again, this is why like having that, I need to paint actually. I'm just going to work with this side for now. Having those edge loops is really crucial because I really can see the symmetry of the model and what I need to be, how I need to maintain the mesh. The loops around the mesh really helpful. It looks like I might want to also start using spine 2 and paint some influence into spine 2, right? Like spine 2 should be here. It should really influence the belly also. Spine 2's got a lot of influence there. Maybe now I'll say smooth and try to kind of smooth that out. Let's go to spine 3. And spine 3 doesn't really have influence over much. Go back to spine 1. I'm going to say replace with the value of 0 some of these. And there still looks like there's maybe something influencing that's pulling. And that might just be the root joint if I scroll all the way up to the root to make sure that this, yeah, I'm just going to go ahead. So another thing that I might do at this point is mirror the skin weights. This is something I can do a bunch of times. If I go to my mesh here, it's selected, I'm going to say mirror skin weights. Let's look at the options here. Okay, so this is the default, and I'm going to say I want to mirror, in this case, across the X and the Y. from positive Z, which is this side, to negative Z. So that's checked on, and I'm just going to say mirror. So now that might help with some of the painting, and that hopefully, and this tool is a bit finicky, but hopefully we have a bit of what we've done on one side is now mirrored to the other side. Okay, a bit. So let's see what it looks like with the spine. The spine stuff looks kind of mirrored as well. So I'm just going to keep working on this. So this is by using that smooth I quite like. Now this model is never going to be in this exaggerated of a pose, but we do exaggerate the pose so that we're able to really affect the model. And there's still something where I'm not having enough influence here. So let's go to replace and say opacity of 0.5 and a value of 1. And I just want to kind of even all of this out here. That looks pretty good. Now that's not really where I want to have influence. This is spine 3, so I definitely want this to be influencing the top of the model. But I haven't deformed this yet either, so I'm not quite sure what this is going to look like. But just between these two, spine 1 also should have some influence over this. That's spine 1. I don't want that. So spine 2 has been rotated. Let's go to smooth. Let's start to smooth this out. On this side, it looks like it needs some work, so maybe replace and then smooth. And make sure, yeah, we have no, let's give this a replace of 0 to these for this joint. Now I might also want to just, yeah, maybe we need this to have a bit more influence. So a value of 1. There, that's looking better. So let's undo that. Let's just paint around the model. And this is where it's a little tricky if we're using the opacity, but maybe we'll replace instead with a value of 0.5 and an opacity of 1. And again, just smooth it out. Okay, so now let's go back here. Let's go ahead and say select the hierarchy and then click on these channels and hit 0, and that will balance everything back, or make sure I said create or select hierarchy and value of 0. Now everything's back down. So now I can select a different joint here. Perhaps this, maybe I'll start with the left shoulder. So let's kind of rotate that shoulder out. Let's also rotate this whole hierarchy kind of up. Okay. And now let's try to fix some of these problem areas. So I'm going to go down to my tool settings, or I'm going to click on my mesh and then my paint skin weights tool, and then go here. And then maybe I'm going to start with the left shoulder. And that left shoulder needs some work. So let's see what we're going to do. First, let's try to smooth this out. And I believe that we want to replace maybe with a value of 0 some of this. We want that left joint, and then let's go back to smooth. We want it to be affecting maybe this side of the mesh a bit more. So replace value of 1. Maybe we'll say opacity of 0.5. some of this, smooth it out. And just have to see what is going to work for your model. Let's also go to the knee and see what's happening with the knee. Let's remove the influence of the knee on these vertices. Since the knee is a bit lower. And back to the shoulder. Let's relax all of this a bit on the underside. And instead work on maybe the top. And let's say smooth it out. Now this joint is never going to stretch this way. Good to see where the influence is around it. And then let's also check out spine 3. It looks like it needs to kind of smooth out here, right? So that if it does go up in the air, that looks a bit better. Spine 2, smooth it again. All right, now I'm going to go back here and select all in the hierarchy and zero everything out. Okay, and now let's rotate this joint. That looks a little bit better. Okay, let's do the knee as well. Let's bend the knee. Looks like the knee is influencing some stuff it should not be. So, and let's rotate this back in a bit, but it's still kind of pulling there. So go to my select here and paint the skin weights, and let's select that knee joint, that left knee. So let's then replace with a value of 0 these vertices here. Make my brush smaller. Make sure the knee's not affecting this. Let's go to smooth now. The knee probably wants to have more influence. Let's say 0.5 for the opacity, or we need a value of 1. Right, I think the knee is going to want to have more influence over these joints. But let's now smooth this out and see if we can get a happy medium. I brush a bit bigger. And let's also just make sure the shoulder here and smooth the shoulder stuff out. Make sure you're working and we're smoothing with an opacity of 1 so that it's having max influence over smoothing everything. Okay, maybe something like that looks pretty good. Okay. All right, so you'll want to go in and you'll want to work on this. Let's go back. Root, modify, hierarchy, and 0 everything out. All right, now let's try this again. Let's maybe rotate this a bit. Right, and the knee looks okay. Looks like it's pulling a bit too much from the top. Let's go to the ankle here. Right, the ankle is pulling from here too. So back and paint skin weights. Let's go to that foot and let's paint a value of 0 make the brush small enough, get rid of its influence over all of this. Okay. And um, we can continue working on the skin weights. But at this point, I'm going to now go to, again, hierarchy, 0 everything. And now I'm going to say mirror the skin weights again. And let's see what that looks like for our mesh. So let's collapse left knee. Let's collapse the neck for now. Let's look at left shoulder versus right shoulder. Just really this one part here needs to be fixed. Let's go to left shoulder to right shoulder. Looks pretty good. Let's go to knee, left knee to right knee. This is where I see some problem areas, is where it's actually, there's the foot, here's the knee. Where it's actually mirrored across, there's still some issues. I think I want this knee. So now you got to go in and just double check everything. Looks good. I don't think we've done the neck or the head. So the neck, I'm going to want to just identify this head region. I'm just going to paint 0 all the way here, and then I'll smooth. And then I want to press replace with a value of 1 for everything on the head, except maybe the ears. So I'm going to increase my brush size. That's maybe too big. And just make sure I have full in that neck is going to rotate the whole head altogether. Now, any kind of facial things that I want to do will be a different tool. Then let's go in here to the head's fine, the ears themselves. So let's go in and paint a value of 0 over all of these vertices for the ears. So I just want to be affecting the ear. Can now smooth that out a bit. Ear tip doesn't need to be affecting anything back here. So really make sure you're going through the entire joint hierarchy and making sure that it's not influencing anything that you don't want it to be influencing. So each joint in the joint hierarchy has to be looked at. The eyes, we don't want to influence anything, which is fine. Let's look at the left ear. I think now if we say mirror skin weights, yeah, now we can see that that's taken care of some of the issues from each side. And go back to the spine here. And we might have to go in and do a little bit more work, but I think for now we're going to call the skin weights done.